It's now 2 p.m. Geneva time. So with your permission, I'm looking here at colleagues, hoping that the sound is good. We will now be launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the recording of this event. I am Diana Rizzoli, the coordinator of the Geneva Environment Network. Welcome to this event, launching a new report published by GRID-Arendal and authored by Karen Raubenheimer and Niko Urho, who we are delighted to welcome again virtually. We have the pleasure to have you today for a new session of the Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues, which have kept the international community in Geneva and beyond engaged on this topic since the end of 2020, making links with various international processes. This third series of dialogues kick off after the adoption last year of a historical resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. The resolution requested the convening of an Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, of which the third session will take place next week in Nairobi, with the preparatory meetings already convening this week. Let me just remind everyone that the Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, and the University of Geneva. Today's session is co-organized with our colleagues and friends at GRID-Arendal, who we would like to thank for sharing with us the opportunity to launch their new report. This event also takes place ahead of the second session of the ad hoc open-ended working group to prepare proposals for the science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, which also was created following the adoption of another historical resolution at last year's United Nations Environmental Assembly. In the context of the triple planetary crisis that the Earth is facing, of climate disruption, nature and biodiversity loss, as well as pollution and waste, two independent international intergovernmental bodies to help policymakers taking the right decisions have been set up for two of these crises. Namely, for the climate change, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as IPCC. For biodiversity loss, we have the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES. The aim of the United Nations Environment Assembly resolution that I have mentioned earlier is to set up a science panel for this third crisis on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention. Before you are formally welcome, let me remind you also that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event, and the link is being shared in the chat and also on the screen. Throughout the event, those of you who are online can raise their questions by using the Q&A box. We have a dedicated session to answer these after the presentations if time allows, and it will allow, I hope. So moving on to the opening session of this event, we are delighted to be joined by representatives of two member states today. Ecuador, who is a member of the Bureau of the Plastics Inc. process. Ecuador will indeed take the presidency of that process after the Nairobi session, and is represented today by Walter Schult, who is now with the permanent mission of the Republic of Ecuador to the United Nations office here in Geneva. We are also joined by a representative of Switzerland, Michel Chiren, who is himself member of the Bureau of the ad hoc open-end working group to prepare proposals for this science policy panel that I mentioned earlier. Mr. Chiren is also the head of the Global Affairs section of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. And after the welcoming remarks, Peter Harris, the Managing Director of GRID-Arendal, will moderate and chair this event. So with no further ado, let's now turn to the opening remarks. And it's my pleasure to turn to Walter Schult for his opening. Walter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Diane. Allow me to thank through you to all the actors of the Geneva Environmental Network with whom I have had the honor to collaborate in the past years, including in the Geneva Plastic Pollution Dialogues. And of course to GRID-Arendal with a very particular congratulations note for Karen and Niko for this preparation of such an important and timely report. The importance of the issue of science policy interface is as one of the key bases for decision making, I think should be defined and recognized permanently for all the states in all the different fora. We should all promote the establishment of mechanisms or space for inadequate interaction between scientists and other actors in different processes of policymaking, because that is not always the case for all the states and not for all the fora. And that interaction should allow for, in our view, to transparent exchange of information, undertaking of assessments, of course, all of that with a view to identify gaps, challenges, opportunities, priorities, and concrete solution, which is the most important. In some cases, that exchange of information may include also support in terms of communication or outreach, which can be operationalized in different cases, for instance, in subsidiary bodies, for example, the SABSTA bodies under the UNFCCC COP or the CBD COP, but also could have the outreach or communication or access to information through bodies such as clearinghouse mechanisms. And we have the examples of the UNCCD Knowledge Hub, the CBD clearinghouse mechanism. We have also under the BBNJ, most recent example of negotiation, both separated SABSTA, scientific body and technical body, and clearinghouse mechanisms. These assessments that are undertaken by these bodies to provide this general function of SPI, in some cases they have very broad mandates to prepare very large scale assessments. You mentioned the two perhaps biggest examples of IPCC and NIBES, but also GEO have sort of a similar mandate. But other examples of much more focused work, such as the CRC under the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention Expert Group on Best Available Techniques, the Ramsar Convention Scientific and Technical Review Panel, the Montreal Protocol Scientific Assessment Panel, among others. The key role in my view, is that they really are able to provide member states and stakeholders with the most relevant scientific and technical information that is needed to implement an MEA and review its efficiency. Here, in terms of review, we have also different examples. Perhaps the most relevant one or updated one will be the one that we have upcoming in only a few weeks, the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, which will provide the first general overall overarching assessment of the efficiency of a Paris Agreement. Now, which model is the best one? Either an SPI that operates as an independent intergovernmental body, or the one that functions a subsidiary body of the governing body of an MEA. There is no silver bullet for that. We think that precisely this type of reports, this tool, will give us examples and lessons learned to decide as member states and other stakeholders which lessons and best practices could be implemented from all of these examples. Another one is the composition of, key element is the composition of these mechanisms. We have to ensure that it guarantees inclusion and representativity of everyone, of all the relevant stakeholders, but also people that are in vulnerable situations, that are most affected by the damages and the hazards, the risk of to the environment, to the health, to human rights that are addressed under the scope of that particular agreement. Here we have identification of indigenous peoples and local communities, in the case of plastics, recyclers or waste pickers, children, women, African descendants, people who live in coastal areas, and of course the most important and vulnerable. We have also, in terms of access to participation, the key instruments that need to be taken into account. Of course, different recognitions or resolutions of different bodies, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, among others. The Escazú Agreement in the case of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And another element on that is the usefulness of principles. We need to ensure that these mechanisms or spaces operate under principles of inclusivity, access to information, as mentioned before, credibility, effectiveness, human rights-based approach, integrity, objectivity, the precautionary principle in the case of environment, and impartiality. A final key feature of an SPI mechanisms or body is also provisions or principles on conflicts of interest. We have also key examples there. The IPCC has established a conflict of interest committee. The Stockholm Convention in Rock has adopted a procedure for dealing with conflict of interest. And perhaps the most known example of Article 5.3 of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which bans the participation and of an influence of the tobacco industry, considering that it is irreconcilable conflict between public health interests and tobacco industry interests. The advantage is that we don't need to start from scratch. We have mandates. You mentioned the two resolutions, 5.8 and 5.14, and I will go a little bit before that, the resolution 4.8 of UNEA, which asked the UNEP to prepare an assessment of all the options for strengthening the science policy interface. We know that among those options, a key one was reflected somehow in the resolution 5.8, saying that the future SPP should be an independent intergovernmental body that is able to deliver policy relevant scientific evidence without being policy prescriptive. The functions of the SPP I wouldn't mention, but those we can imagine that will serve and benefit for sure the future plastic treaty, just in terms of the identification of issues of relevance, conduction of assessment, the provision of update information, facilitation of information sharing, and the two additional functions that have been identified so far in the two parts of the first session of the open-ended working group of the SPP, the one on capacity building and on the financial assistance. 514 resolution also provides includes a key provision that I always highlight, and we have as Ecuador and through our member in the Bureau, Ambassador Vallas, being recalling, which is the possibility for the INC to consider a mechanism to provide policy relevant scientific and socioeconomic information and assessment related to plastic pollution. It has other provisions as well, that resolution in terms of assessment of periodic progress, assessment of effectiveness, socioeconomic assessments also related to plastic pollution, among others. It is expected that the future instrument take into account the best available science, traditional knowledge, and knowledge of indigenous peoples as well, and best practices from all the different settings. We know that it hasn't been easy because INC has been focused so far in other perhaps more urgent matters, but we know for sure that in a potential dedicated specific mechanism on SPI for the treaty will be more than relevant. That includes again full participation, and in that regard we have been particularly our member of the Bureau, Ambassador Valles, and future incoming president, and we did this I will finish, has been already engaging with a lot of different exchanges with the scientific community. We have two members in the group of experts that was convened by UK and Brazil, and we have been co-sponsoring resolutions and decisions different in relation to strengthening the provision of capacity building, science-based assessment and research, including in relation to pollution from plastics. We just want to end with commending the preparation of this report. We think it will be a very useful tool for all the discussions that are upcoming, both in the INC3 and next meetings of the INC process, but also in the second session of the open-ended working group. We believe that the complementarity feature and characteristics that have been identified in the different examples of SPI mechanisms so far is perhaps the key to use. We think complementarity is possible. We think we have a number of examples and evidence of the importance of that information, and we are just inviting everyone to really get into deep into this report. I will also continue to look at it. So without having a definite national position on it, we just want to congratulate again the preparation of such an important report that will be very useful for these two processes and other processes, and complementarity interaction with other MEAs as well. So thank you again, and looking forward to hear the presentation of the report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schultz. We will now move to Mr. Chihan from Switzerland. Michel, you have the floor. You're muted, Michel.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks for giving me the floor, Diana. I would like to thank the Geneva Environment Network and the GRID-Arendal for organizing this event today and for having me. It's good to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity to give some remarks. Switzerland has been very active with regard to further strengthening the science policy interface so that international policy decisions are based on sound science. Switzerland is an active actor in bodies such as the IPCC, the IPBES, or the IRP, and we are of course pleased to have a strong role in the establishment of the new Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution. I certainly agree with my previous speaker. It's important to speak about science to policy and policy to science. As in the context of the triple planetary crisis, we need the robust science in order to make good decisions and good policies. And that scientific basis needs to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And in the context of the plastic pollution, this means that the new Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution will have to hear which scientific mappings and scientific assessments are needed. The report presented today can help to understand the scientific and technical needs based on existing UNEA resolutions and also learning from existing MEAs. It is also important then, of course, to listen carefully to the INC process in order to know what is needed and which are the policy questions that scientific work needs to happen on. Today's report will also help to inform about the initial background to kick off the discussion on possible linkages between the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution and the upcoming plastic treaty. Once this is clear, it is easier to discuss if and what the plastics treaty would need in terms of scientific committees under the treaty and what kind of scientific work needs to be done specifically under the treaty with regard to specific scientific questions and technical work on the day-to-day implementation of the treaty. For example, the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution could identify potential chemicals, polymers and products of concern through its ongoing horizon scanning exercise and inform the treaty about potential review and making recommendations with regard to listing or amendments of or other amendments of the treaty. And the report, today's report, can inform the open-ended working group process of the Science Policy Panel about what kind of demands could come in the future from different multilateral environmental agreements or other bodies, and including from the future plastics treaty. So again, of course, it goes both ways. With that, again, many thanks to having me. I want to express my thanks to the authors, Karen and Niko, for this important report. And thanks again to the GRID-Arendal and to the Geneva Environment Network for this important event today. And we are looking to hearing the presentations on the report, of course, most importantly. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Michael and Walter and Diana, for those very interesting and inspiring opening remarks. My name is Peter Harris. I'm the Managing Director here at GRID-Arendal, and I'll be moderating the rest of this session. I'll just tell you a little bit about GRID-Arendal for those who don't know what we are. We are a small Norwegian foundation located here in beautiful southern Norway. And we have been established back in 1989 by the Norwegian government to support UNEP. And our role is to focus on science communication, and particularly working at the science policy interface. The 1963 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Carl Ziegler and Giulio Natta for their remarkable innovation in the creation of a long polyethylene chain out of chemical monomers. The age of plastics had begun. This groundbreaking development set the stage for the widespread use of plastics, changing our world in unimaginable ways. 60 years later, the extensive use of plastics and their products is posing a threat to human health and to the environment. The situation has reached a critical juncture where we need to plan our future based on scientific evidence and knowledge. Now, we have heard already about the United Nations Environment Assembly resolutions that have called for the world to address this pollution plastic problem, including the establishment of the Science Policy Panel and, of course, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. In this context, GRID-Arendal, together with two lead authors, Niko, Urho and Karen Raubenheimer, embarked on the preparation of the report that we are launching today. Our aim is to provide a sound, critical, and timely contribution addressing the scientific and technical support needed by decision makers to develop an effective global plastic instrument. And as we've heard, the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, will be meeting next week in Nairobi. We would like to say thank you to the Norwegian government for providing the funding that has made this report possible. We also would like to express our gratitude to all the members of the advisory group who actively participated, shared their comments, and provided feedback. So today on the panel, we will hear from the leading authors of the report, as well as from experts who will share their views. We will hear also from the member states. We just heard from Ecuador, but we'll also be hearing from Ghana and Switzerland. Today's discussion will focus on the science policy interface for plastic pollution from different perspectives, such as human rights, human health, social science, and environmental protection. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the two co-authors of this report, Karen Raubenheimer and Niko Urho, who will be providing us with a good overview of this report. And I hand the chair over to Karen and Niko to take us through the report. Please.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and good day to everyone on behalf of myself and Niko. So today we will break the presentation into two sections. If you could go to the beginning of the presentation, thank you. And the next slide. If we'll break it into two sections, I will present on the possible functions of the science policy interface for plastic pollution. And then Niko will present on the possible institutional approaches to realize these functions. Next slide. So to begin with the first section, we'll go to the next slide and ask ourselves firstly, what is a science policy interface? So these are defined as social processes that encompass relations between scientists and other actors in the policy process. They allow for exchanges as well as co-evolution, and the primary aim here is to enrich the decision-making process. Any communication of knowledge should be policy relevant and policy prescriptive, as we've heard, and it should provide solution-oriented assessments. But importantly, the communication must allow decision makers to balance competing priorities. The science policy interfaces can perform a spectrum of functions and can also assist in large-scale assessments, as we heard, such as the Global Environmental Outlook. But overall, the fundamental role of a science policy interface is to provide member states and stakeholders with the scientific and technical information needed to implement the agreement and to review them. A science policy interface may, as we heard, operate as an independent intergovernmental body, or it could function as a subsidiary body of the governing body to the agreement. However, the credibility, legitimacy, and salience are widely recognized as foundational to any science policy interface. Next slide, please. So if we think about the science policy interface for plastic pollution more broadly, it would firstly include those functions needed to support the parties to the new plastics instrument, but also those functions that will be carried out by the new science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution that can also support the new plastics instrument. And then there are also the science policy interfaces of other agreements that could complement the plastics instrument. But Niko will provide some more examples of these later in the presentation. Next slide. So how did we select the functions that are suggested in the report? Firstly, we reviewed any studies on effective science policy interfaces of relevance. We also took guidance from the 2 UNEA resolutions we heard of, 5/14 on the plastics instrument and 5/8 on the science policy panel. And then we had an excellent support from a large expert group, as Peter said. We also had responses to a survey, as well as collaborative workshops, and then review of 2 drafts of the report. And here, again, I'd like to extend our thanks to everyone who helped, including the team at GRID-Arendal. Next slide. So looking at the functions themselves, we grouped the 10 suggested science policy functions across 4 phases of the policy cycle, with cross-cutting functions shown in the center of this diagram. So by grouping them across the policy life cycle, it helps us to understand the nature of the outputs that are needed in each phase. Next slide. In the first phase of agenda setting, problem recognition and issue selection are key, but this must be based on scientific and technical information. And here we have horizon scanning, which is important to help detect early signs of change that are not yet on the policy radar. In the context of plastics, this can include risks related to novel entities, legacy plastics, and new technologies and practices. But horizon scanning should be distinguished from foresight, which is a broader concept that aims to evaluate possible futures and then actions to promote the desired outcomes. Foresight uses horizon scanning as one of its techniques, among many others. Next slide, please. And then in the second phase of policy formulation, policies are developed based on scientific input. Here, the scientific criteria for control measures can play an important role and help give effect to the core control measures of the plastics instrument. Such criteria can be developed to identify chemicals, polymers, and products of concern, to identify sustainable alternatives and non-plastic substitutes, to promote safe and sustainable design, to promote environmentally sound waste management, and to promote access to information or transparency. Also in this phase, we have the function of assessment of scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information. This function will commonly focus on aggregating and assessing existing research rather than conducting new research. Addressing the plastics pollution crisis more comprehensively would also benefit from global assessments that are iterative and that address both the environmental and human health aspect, but thematic assessments can also be conducted as needed. Next slide, please. This table in the slide here aims to show in more detail how the possible criteria for control measures can help address the main phases of the plastics life cycle, in particular the upstream and the midstream phases. Firstly, the criteria to identify chemicals and polymers of concern and criteria to identify sustainable alternatives would support the control measures in the chemicals phase or the upstream phase. Then criteria to identify products of concern, criteria to identify non-plastic substitutes, and criteria to promote sustainable design would support control measures in the material phase or the midstream phase. And finally, criteria to promote environmentally sound waste management are relevant in the disposal phase or the downstream phase. But strong scientific support is needed in the development of such criteria, as well as the review of chemicals, polymers, and products of concern. Next slide, please. In the implementation phase, focus is on government action, but this needs strong scientific and technical support again. And here policy support tools are needed to enhance the compliance and implementation. But these could include technical guidelines, best available techniques, and best environment practices, as well as toolkits. So such tools are particularly benefit developing countries that often lack the resources needed to implement agreements. And then knowledge management mechanisms can provide a centralized platform to manage and present data. This could include the development of a digital database for data on chemicals, polymers, and products of concern, as well as knowledge management hubs for visualizing progress. Another function in this phase is the catalyzing of knowledge generation, which is needed to ensure the availability of credible scientific information. A pressing challenge, though, is ensuring the availability and accessibility of relevant and reliable scientific information, especially from developing countries. Next slide. In the fourth phase of evaluation, assessment of progress and effectiveness is made, and this also requires very significant scientific and technical input. Here, the monitoring of global progress requires scientific and technical support for developing and updating of indicators and harmonizing methodologies for data collection. This includes monitoring plastic flows and leakage, as well as concentrations of plastics in biota and human populations, and determining greenhouse gas emissions across the life cycle of plastics. And then the evaluation of effectiveness is also needed to understand the impact of policy interventions in solving the problem. These could include determining the effectiveness of national action and individual response options, which would also then support evidence-based policymaking. Next slide. Finally, we have the cross-cutting functions, which address two or more phases of the policy cycle. This includes capacity building and communication and outreach. We know that enhancing capacities is crucial for amplifying the reach and the impact of initiatives, and can be linked to all the other functions that we've described here so far. Communication and outreach is also needed to help decision makers and to make more informed decisions, but also to inform the public. And with that, I think I will hand over to Niko to present the possible institutional approaches to realize the scientific policy functions for plastic pollution. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll present the possible institutional approaches to realize the science policy interface functions for plastic pollution just presented by Karen. And this will focus particularly on the possible division of labor between the science policy panel and the plastics instrument. Next slide, please. So before going into specific institutional approaches, I would like to provide a short overview of the science policy landscape for plastic pollution, also to complement the opening words by Walter. First, cooperation with the science policy panel is important to ensure that the plastics instrument will benefit from independent scientific advice across the policy cycles. Second, cooperation with the scientific and technical bodies under MEAs is also important, and this concerns MEAs in the climate, chemicals and waste, and biodiversity clusters. And some of these scientific bodies have already initiated work streams on plastic pollution. Third, cooperation will also be needed to enhance with other relevant science policy interface bodies and sectoral multilateral bodies that are engaged in scientific and technical work, such as in the areas of trade, human health, socioeconomic, and human health issues. Next, I will focus on the possible division of labor between the plastics instrument and the science policy panel in delivering the functions presented by Karen. So next slide, please. So the proposed division of labor that we have outlined is grounded on the science policy mandates of the science policy panel outlined in Union Resolution 5/8 and the plastics instrument outlined in Union Resolution 5/14 as mentioned by Karen. So this figure shows that most of the functions are explicitly mentioned by one or both of these Union resolutions, and if not, they are indirectly linked to other functions. Next slide, please. In the agenda setting phase, a predominant role is envisaged for the science policy panel that has a horizon scanning function aiming to identify issues of relevance to policymakers, including those emerging threats. This function could help to proactively identify potential products, polymers, and chemicals of concern. The provision of evidence-based options to address them would help in policy formulation, which brings us to the next phase. Next slide, please. Here in the policy formulation phase, the use of scientific criteria for control measures could help to provide scientific advice to facilitate informed decision-making on a number of issues. What is important here is to close the governance gap in the upstream phase of the plastics value chain. And this is the very reason why we recommend the development of a scientific and technical body on chemical, polymer, and product safety. And its tasks could include, firstly, reviewing nominations for listing chemicals, polymers, and products of concern. Secondly, identifying sustainable alternatives and substitutes based on socioeconomic assessments. And thirdly, developing and updating criteria for sustainable and safe design of plastics. Also, a supporting role is envisaged for the Science Policy Panel. Given the panel has a horizon scanning function, it would seem sensible that it could also present chemicals, polymers, and products of concern to the possible review committee under the plastic instrument. Next slide, please. Assessment is an important function, and this can also support policy formulation. First, this could include the development of global assessments. Conducting the global assessments under the Science Policy Panel is recommended to help increase the credibility of the outputs due to the panel's independent and authoritative role. And if global assessments cannot be prepared by the panel, then a possible dedicated body under the plastics instrument could take over. This would then follow the example of the Montreal Protocol that has a scientific assessment panel and an environmental effects assessment panel. And secondly, both the Science Policy Panel and the plastics instrument could develop thematic assessments as needs arise. Next slide, please. Let's move to the third policy phase, the implementation phase, where we focus on practical aspects that will need scientific and technical support. The development of policy support tools is envisaged to take place mainly under the plastics instrument, either through ad hoc expert groups or through a subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice. The Science Policy Panel is not explicitly mandated to develop policy support tools, but it could potentially assist in certain areas, following the examples of the IPCC and IPBES. Knowledge management systems, though not mentioned in the UNEA resolutions, could be developed by either body. Spearheaded by the Science Policy Panel, such systems might cover all forms of chemicals and pollution, making plastic pollution a subset of the broader environmental agenda. Alternatively, if the plastic instrument takes the lead, the secretariat of the instrument could be tasked to focus exclusively on plastic pollution. Catalyzing knowledge generation is a shared function between the bodies. The plastics instrument might play an important role in empowering institutions at various levels to undertake research, while the Science Policy Panel would help to identify research gaps and direct future research. Next slide, please. Turning to the final stage, evaluation, we see the plastics instruments playing a central role. Scientific experts can contribute to the development of an indicator framework alongside standardized methodologies for data collection to enable comprehensive global monitoring and effectiveness evaluation. This could include the development of a global monitoring plan and an effectiveness evaluation process overseen by regional coordination groups appointed by governments and supported by an open-ended scientific group. The Science Policy Panel could have a supporting role in context of its possible role in developing global assessments. This could include an independent assessment of progress and effectiveness of the plastics instrument, especially if requested by the plastics instrument. Next slide, please. Then lastly, what about the cross-cutting functions? Well, capacity building along with communication and outreach have a pronounced role under the Science Policy Panel in line with UNEA Resolution 5/8. So the panel could take a comprehensive approach by enhancing the foundational competencies of scientists and utilizing the dedicated communication and outreach function of the panel. Capacity building could also be intertwined in the science policy functions of the plastics instrument. And then the next concluding slide. So coming to the conclusions and next steps. So based on the variety of functions presented today, it's important to first identify and prioritize key functions considered essential to meet the specific needs of the plastic instrument. And then it is also necessary to consider how collaboration with the Science Policy Panel and other science policy interfaces can help co-deliver these functions. The last step includes the identification of appropriate institutional approaches, also taking into account the existing mandates. And how to achieve this? Well, INC3 could initiate intersessional work to develop a science policy interface for plastic pollution. It is important to start now because functions need to be aligned with a science policy panel that has also to be concluded by end of 2024. Also, it would be beneficial to conduct a comparative study on existing bodies linked to MEAs to inform future decision making. And thank you very much. That was the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen and Niko, for that very interesting and very thorough presentation on the report. So now we're going to have a series of stakeholders' perspectives on the report. And I think if Ana Paula de Souza is available online, I will hand the chair over to her to give us an answer to this question. Anna, coming from the human rights area of from Geneva, from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I'd like to ask the question, how can this science policy interface deliver on human rights standards? Ana Paula?
Yes, I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depends on from where you are joining. Thank you for the invitation to join this panel today, and to GRID-Arendal for the opportunity to comment and collaborate in this important report, which we hope will shed light in the upcoming negotiations at INC3 and the second session of the open-ended working group. As we know, plastic pollution and pollution more broadly are responsible for ongoing massive human rights harm that negatively affect multiple aspects of human rights. Thanks to the best available science, we know now, for instance, that plastics are accumulating in food chains, contaminating water, soil, and air, and releasing hazardous substances into the environment. We also know that microplastics are being found in human blood, lungs, and placenta, as well in livestock feed and milk and meat products. And the exposure to toxic chemicals often found in plastics is impacting fertility, shortening gestation periods, and lowering birth weight. In other words, science is showing us that the plastic cycle has become a threat to all human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, life, health, food, water and sanitation, and equality and no discrimination. And in doing so, science can give the tools for policymakers to take informed right-based decisions. As we know, reality is not a bed of roses. Heavy corporate influence on regulatory processes, dire attacks on scientific studies, smear campaigns against scientists themselves, and the denial of science has been propelling us ever deeper into environmental catastrophe. Big industries, including those directly benefiting from plastic pollution, have worked to suffocate scientific evidence at the expense of people and the planet. And this is the very reason why the right to science needs to be protected. For science to flourish and develop, the principles of integrity, transparency, and participation are essential to make science objective and reliable, and to ensure that it's not subject to interests that are not scientific or are inconsistent with fundamental human rights principles and the welfare of society. And how can this be translated into practice? A human rights-based approach to addressing pollution calls for a vision that aligns with scientific evidence, centers on principles of accountability and informed participation, and gives special attention to the needs of people in vulnerable situations. It also requires actions to be guided by key principles, including precaution, prevention, intergenerational equity, and non-discrimination. In other words, this requires that an effective science policy interface mechanism engages all relevant stakeholders and disciplines securing opportunities for informed participation. The citizen science model of engagement, which ties scientific inquiry to the needs of communities, can contribute to the relevance and impact of the scientific research, ensuring that the benefits of science reach the very people who need their application. Knowledge empowers the communities to exercise agency on their own behalf. Information concerning the risks and benefits of science and technology should be accessible without discrimination. The new science policy mechanisms must put in place all necessary efforts to overcome persistent inequalities in scientific advancement through culturally and gender-appropriate means of education and communication, with the aim of encouraging the widest participation in scientific progress of these populations that have traditionally been excluded from such process. Special attention should be paid to groups that have experienced systemic discrimination in the enjoyment of the right to participate in and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application. These include women, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, frontline communities, and persons living in poverty. As a precondition, there should also be an enabling environment for the conduct of scientific inquiry free, with specific guidelines to ensure the protection of scientists engaging with their respective mandates. Drawing from the study, the new science policy mechanisms to deal with plastic pollution within the new Treaty on Plastics and pollution more broadly within the SPP must include safeguards to avoid the risks associated with the existence of conflicts of interest by creating an environment in which actual or perceived conflicts of interest are adequately disclosed and regulated, especially those involving scientific researchers who give policy advice to policymakers and other public officials. Guidelines should also be in place to safeguard against attempts by business entities to achieve policy change by influencing research and knowledge production. For all this to happen, it's crucial that the mandate of the new science policy interfaces, including explicitly refer to human rights, including the rights to health environment, and the right to everyone to enjoy the benefits of science. In closing, systemic change is necessary to stop the flow of plastic waste into the environment. The path requires, amongst other actions, a reorientation of the purpose of business in society, changing irresponsible business models while ensuring transparency throughout the life cycle of plastics and accountability and remedy for harms caused. For this to happen, we must protect the science to ensure that everyone can enjoy its benefits. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ana Paula, for that very interesting perspective. Yes, legitimacy and of science and how it's conducted and how it's and applied in this context is very interesting from the human rights perspective. By the way, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end of these presentations, so please stay on online, and if you have a question for any one of the speakers, Karen, Niko, or Ana Paula, or the ones who follow, please keep track of those, and you can put them into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the session. So thank you, Ana Paula. And we'll move on now to the next speaker, who will be Sam Adukumi. And Sam is he's the executive director of Enviro Health and a national expert at chemicals and waste in Ghana. And welcome, Sam. And I'd like to ask you this question. What are the ways to overcome challenges of a robust science policy interface in an African context? Over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, as the case may be, around the globe. Can you hear me, please? I want to ensure if you can hear me.
You're a bit garbled, but we can hear you. Keep going.
Okay. So before I propose some solutions, let me make this important submission that many of the existing initiatives globally that seek to improve the use of scientific and other knowledge forms in policy decisions, such as the Intergovernmental Platform or Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPABEX, phase a number of challenges in terms of mainly three things. One, effective communication. Two, mobilization of diverse knowledge forms. And three, acting upon research findings. These are mainly because the science policy interactions are conceptualized as linear processes where science is assumed to provide clear, relevant, credible, legitimate, and actionable knowledge on which decision makers will pursue decisions. So it has been realized that when science policy interfaces are managed as collaborative, nonlinear processes, scientists, decision makers, and the general public are engaged in an iterative process and negotiate together what information is needed and what kind of evidence is relevant in the given situation. So here, what I'm trying to say is that the nonlinear approach to SPIs can actually consider as way forward towards improved implementation and behavioral change. And it also creates space for debate over conflicting beliefs and values and interests. So first of all, to touch about the mobilization of the diverse information forms, thankfully, the knowledge management mechanism, which has been realized under report, actually is encouraging because the SPI on plastics, if it's managed as collaborative and in a nonlinear approach, this will encourage scientists, decision makers, and general public from Africa in particular, or in developing countries, to engage in an alternative process and negotiate together what information is needed and what kind of evidence is relevant in the given situation. So here, we always talk about use of indigenous or traditional knowledge, which is critical for Africa and other developing countries. Now, talking about effective communication. Also, thankfully, under the report, there is an area on communication and outreach as part of the cross-cutting functions. So this will really help in terms of both internal communication and external communication, as has been realized. So I believe that there's a need for establishing a knowledge management mechanism and data hubs, particularly in developing countries such as Africa. Now, talking about acting upon research findings. First of all, in developing countries, we even know or we need the generation of data or conducting the research in the first place, which could be followed by the action on the findings. Here, we talk about capacity building, which is very critical, and this has been identified as one of the cross-cutting issues. So we call for establishment of a dedicated, reliable, and sustainable funding mechanism, which will help build capacities in developing countries. And this also facilitates the involvement of developing countries such as Africa in the entire process. Perhaps to end my submission, one of the areas that have been recommended in the report is about development of policy support tools such as technical guidelines, best available technologies and techniques, and also best environmental practices, toolkits which will help in the policy formulation for Africa. So I believe these are a number of things that perhaps, if are considered, will help get a robust SPI for the future. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sam. Very interesting and insightful. I like the way we must recognize different kinds of knowledge, and we must also, of course, recognize the needs for capacity building, and in particular communication in the African context and the challenges faced there. developing new knowledge in Africa. Thank you very much. We're moving on then to our next speaker. It's going to be Christos Simonides, who is a clinical and research specialist at the Minderoo Foundation in Australia. Welcome, Christos. I'd like to ask this question to you. How can science policy interface for plastic pollution answer interdisciplinary concerns such as human health? Christos, please. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you especially for raising human health in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty and its science policy interface. I'm a clinical and research principal with the Minderoo Foundation. I'm also a pediatrician and an environmental epidemiology researcher and an author on the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health. Having health foremost there, I'd like to start by extending my thanks and congratulations to Karen, Niko, and the broader authorship for this critical and timely report. The negotiation of the Global Plastics Treaty, we, the global community, are standing at a crossroads with respect to managing our relationship with plastics. There is an urgent need to strengthen the science policy interface if this is to lead to meaningful change that takes us down a different path. It's science that has brought us to the realization that our current relationship with plastics is not sustainable. The science of environmental and human health impacts of plastics throughout the production, use, and disposal phases of plastics. These are major externalities of plastics that are not currently incorporated into its economics and urgently need to be addressed in the face of plastic production that is already unsustainable and continues to rapidly escalate, as we've been hearing today. It's also a science that offers a safer path forward, though. The science of biomonitoring and human health surveillance, the science of green chemistry and alternatives, and the multidisciplinary science of transition and system change. If the global community embeds a science-informed approach at the centre of this treaty, it sets itself up to avoid repeating the mistakes that have got us here in the first place and addressing these problems with health. So that's the why we need an effective and comprehensive science policy interface for an effective and comprehensive plastics treaty. I think, to me, what this report released today critically offers is the what and the how. The report is a roadmap of an effective science policy landscape that offers confidence that this is absolutely achievable and a clear path to get there. As we've heard today, the report identifies and explores 10 key functions. It researches and summarizes what the relevant capacity is already present across other existing science policy interfaces, what's in development within the mandated scope of the SPP Science Policy Panel, and what additional gaps would need filling to meet the goals of the Plastic Treaty. And critically, how the three could work together hand in hand. Pity asked me to comment on how the science policy interface for plastic pollution can answer interdisciplinary concerns such as human health. Well, there are two key conclusions I take away from this report. Firstly, a successful global plastics treaty absolutely will need its own dedicated science policy functions within the plastics instrument to address issues such as human health. There are essential functions not captured within the mandate of other science policy interfaces or that are specialized, such as a separate body would be more efficient and responsive. The added value of science policy functions with respect to the goals of the treaty is clearly articulated throughout section 2 of the report, and I'd encourage people to look at that. Secondly, I conclude that an effective science policy interface able to address interdisciplinary issues such as human health is absolutely achievable. This critical report demonstrates how the science policy interface needed for an effective treaty can be mapped out into discrete individual functions, and broken down this way, the complex becomes clear. We can see and make provision for the full breadth of independent interdisciplinary scientific input that's needed. We can explore where their functions and capacity may already be present, and where there's opportunity for synergies and cooperation. Or where that capacity is missing, we can see where there are examples of similar functions within existing multilateral environmental agreements, which then offer established precedents to draw upon or learn from. So I'd like to wrap up by saying I see this report as a reason for optimism at this critical crossroads in the global treaty. and very welcome because of that. With this report, member states and observers now come to INC3 with a roadmap to build an effective science policy landscape to support the treaty. And with this, an effective plastics treaty that can lead to meaningful change in our unsustainable relationship with plastics, including its impacts on human health. So thank you again.
Great, thank you very much, Christos. A very positive, inspiring look at the report. We have a report, we have a way forward, we have a roadmap to follow, and it's all, as you say, it's all achievable. So that's very positive. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our next speaker, who is Amelia Abenayaka. She's from the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty in Japan. And I'd like to ask Amelia, if you're there, if you can, try to address this question. What are the key principles for an effective science policy interface, including upholding the integrity of the scientific process and preventing conflicts of interest? This is quite a critical question. So Amelia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter. So yeah, I will quickly go through my organizational background. Yeah, so good day everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. And I would like to first congratulate the authors and the GRID-Arendal and the Geneva network for this very important and comprehensive work. Yeah, so I will quickly go through the Scientist Coalition background and etc., and then quickly come back to your question. The Scientist Coalition is for Effective Plastic Treaty. The coalition is an international network of diverse, independent scientific and technical experts. We seek to contribute with summaries and interpretations of scientific knowledge to decision makers and other stakeholders involved in the negotiations towards a global agreement to end the plastic pollution. Yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, and here, building on the work of the number of groups, we recommended to proceed with the development of safety, sustainability, essentiality, and transparency assessment criteria for chemicals, polymers, products, technologies, and systems along the entire life cycle of plastics, including alternatives and substitutes. These criteria would guide decision-making on core obligations and control measures. These dimensions are mutually supportive and reinforcing to omission of one potentially representing a significant governance gap. They should be guided by independent expertise and scientific consensus and the principles of the latest version of zero waste hierarchy, prevention, and precaution. Next, please. With respect to the science policy interface of the treaty itself, we draw from the 2021 the Nordic report to meet 4 key requirements: credibility, legitimacy, salience, and agility. These requirements can be best realized through the establishment of dedicated scientific body under the future instrument. I think that part already discussed by the authors first. The science policy interface may develop a hybrid regulatory classification system based on the pre-existing assessment criteria guided by the BRS secretariat, etc. And then could consist of 4 lists, like mentioned, prohibited, restricted, permitted, and exempt kind of list. And this can be amended with the future treaty. Next, please. Thank you. Then I will go to the question, the key principles for an effective science policy interface, considering transparency, ethics kind of aspects. First, let's go with the transparency. Communicate the source of information and methods to arrive at scientific conclusions. and make scientific information and data accessible to policymakers, the public, and the other stakeholders, including scientific community. And then the scientific integrity comes, ensure that the scientific process is based on rigorous methods, peer review, and sound research ethics, and also guard against bias, manipulation, or distortion of scientific findings to serve specific policy agendas. And then the independence, maintain the independence of scientific institutions and researchers from political or corporate influences, and also protect scientists from undue pressure to conform to specific policy positions. And also the inclusivity. I think the previous speakers also mentioned, especially the maintain the inclusivity, involve the diverse range of experts and stakeholders in the science policy dialogue to represent a wide array of perspectives. And also strive for balance between various interests and considerations such as economic, environmental, and social concerns. And then the ethics and conflict of interest. Establish a clear guidelines and mechanisms to identify and manage conflicts of interest among scientists, policymakers, and other stakeholders. This probably require a disclosure of financial, personal, or institutional interest that could compromise the impartiality of the science policy process. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. Then the communication and engagement. The foster effective communication between scientists and policymakers, emphasizing plain language and clarity. Translate complex scientific information into understandable terms for non-expert audiences, including policymakers, general public, etc. Involve the public in the science policy dialogue to build trust, promote understanding, and increase the legitimacy of policy decisions. And also accountability. Hold both scientists and policymakers accountable for their roles in the science policy interface. Review and evaluate the effectiveness of the interface of providing evidence-based policy recommendations. And then the long-term perspectives, including the flexibility. Recognize the importance of a long-term vision of a science policy interactions. Also, some issues require sustained engagement and monitoring, adapt to change the circumstances and emerging scientific knowledge, and while maintaining the strong commitment to the evidence-based decision making. And last but not least, I think Sam also mentioned the regional context, which we faced with the Asian context, especially in developing countries, similar to the African context as well. The specific challenges and opportunities need to be considered, especially capacity building and the other gaps identification. Identified in the zero draft as well. So implementation and capacity building kind of stuff also need to consider in the regional context. Yeah, and thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Emila, for that interesting presentation. And I follow again what you've just said regarding the situation that is challenging in particular geographic locations in developing countries, but where we want to develop a good process to avoid conflicts of interest. Your presentation has covered a lot of the territory very thoroughly. Thank you very much for that. We're coming then to our final speaker in this session. We have with us, I hope, Jacob Keane-Hammerson. Welcome, Jacob. You're an ocean campaigner from the Environmental Investigation Agency in the UK. And I'd like, if you could, to answer this question. What are the key factors for an effective science policy interface mechanism from the civil society perspective? Over to you, Jacob. You have the floor.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to GRID-Arendal and the Geneva Environment Network for organising this really timely and important discussion. And I'd also like to congratulate Karen and Niko and all the authors of the really comprehensive overview of the science policy interface options for the new instrument that is to be negotiated. So firstly, I won't say that I could speak on behalf of the entirety of civil society, but I'll certainly try and give, EIA's perspectives to begin with. And we really believe that having an effective institutional structure, including an efficient and regular interface between science and policy, is really essential to a well-functioning treaty. So I'm going to use my time to highlight what we believe are some of the essential aspects of the science policy interface and the bodies that should be established under the instrument to facilitate this. So firstly, we think there are three essential areas of assessment that need to be played out into the new instrument, which is the scientific assessment, which we've heard a lot about today, the technical assessment, which has also been mentioned, and the socio-economic assessment of the instrument and its implementation. And while these are distinct functions from one another, they could be organized in a number of ways. We heard Niko mention that the Montreal Protocol, for example, has a scientific assessment panel and a technical and economic assessment panel, as well as the environmental effects panel. So these are some ways that we could use the report to look at organizing these bodies. So the roles are really essential to the day-to-day functioning of the new treaty and the iterative process of policy making that we want to undergo in the new instrument and this generational undertaking to end plastic pollution. And these include the kind of really critical responsibilities, including horizon scanning for future issues that were mentioned, reviewing the reporting and monitoring data that is provided by the parties, providing assessment of substitutes and alternatives, success of the control measures and the treaty as a whole, and including as well, which I think hasn't been mentioned today, is the financial needs of parties and the replenishment of any funds that will be established to support the instrument. Secondly, we think it's important to set a really firm and stable foundation from the outset, and that comes with this clear institutional structure. So we actually think there's a key difference between including within the text of the instrument a provision that allows the governing body to establish these bodies at some time, rather than establishing them directly within the text of the agreement as standing bodies. So we actually think we would really encourage negotiators to consider doing this, because this gives the bodies a particular prominence for the importance of their role, which we have heard so much about today, and it's able to outline the key functions that would be expected of them. And as it relates to the science policy interface functions and its relation to the science policy panel that is currently being negotiated, we at EIA at least believe that it's really essential to keep all the necessary functions of the SPI within the architecture of the agreement, so it's able to function holistically on its own. So the science policy interface will, under the instrument, will need to be able to answer specific questions as they relate to policy making, for example, on thresholds for impacts on biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems as it relates to the impacts of plastic pollution and scanning of emerging issues that should be addressed. It's really important we don't lose these functions from within the architecture of the instrument, as these bodies will exist to speak specifically to the governing body and provide advice and counsel in the policy-making process across the full life cycle of plastics. And not having such functions could be limiting its ability to play a key role from the outset. But of course, it will be important to ensure coordination and cooperation between the SPP and for it to continue its work with it under its mandate. And we would encourage cooperation as much as possible. And while I did preface my intervention at the beginning saying that I couldn't speak on behalf of all civil society, EIA is part of Break Free from Plastic, which is a global movement of more than 2,700 organizations and 1,000 individuals who are envisioning a world free from plastic. And one of Break Free from Plastic's priorities is the establishment of a science policy interface. And I'd just like to summarize Break Free from Plastic's views that the science policy interface needs to be established within the Global Plastics Treaty and should take at least the form of a subsidiary body. The SPI requires a robust conflict of interest policy and its strict implementation to ensure that the conflict of interests are avoided and to ensure the integrity of the body. Break Free from Plastic also highlights the need for the science policy interface to be inclusive. And really what we mean is it should reflect regional, gendered, disciplinary, sectoral and multi-stakeholder representation that includes impacted communities and Indigenous peoples. And finally, the science policy interface must be agile with inbuilt review and scientific flexibility. So I would just like to close now by once again thanking the authors of the report and the organisers of the webinar and the other panelists who provided their really key insights. So yeah, thank you once again.
Right, thank you very much, Jacob, for that that overview. Good point about the funding mechanisms that need to go along with creating any other bodies under the instrument, and the point you make very well about that there needs to be a science policy body within the instrument. That's a good point. So that's a good place now to open the floor for some discussion. We have about 15 minutes remaining in this webinar, and we have had some questions coming in whilst we've been speaking. So I will read the first one on my list here from Carolina. How can industry stakeholders be able to be involved in this effort moving forward? So what role is industry going to have in going forward with this? And maybe I'll start by asking if Karen and Niko could have a view on this question, and then anyone else is welcome to also chime in afterwards. But Karen and Niko, have you got a view on this one?
Thank you. It's a very good question. I can try to respond to it. We have only touched upon the issue in the report and not going very much in depth into this issue, but a very technical expertise is definitely needed from industry. They have a lot of knowledge that needs to be tapped into that probably cannot be found within the remits of the scientific community. And here, one example is provided by the Montreal Protocol's Technology and Economic Assessment Panel, also known as the TEA panel. And this is organized into 6 technical options committees known as TOCs for industrial sectors. And they have experts from industry, government, academics, and these are nominated by parties, and they are selected primarily based on their technical experts. So all of these 6 technical options committees have hundreds of experts, many of which come from the industry, but are selected based on technical expertise. So here also I would underpin the need to develop a robust conflict of interest policy, mentioned almost by every panelist here today, with clear guidelines how to manage this conflict of interest, as mentioned by Amila, to disclose any information on financial and other interest. And this is important to really emphasize the principles of objectivity and integrity that are guiding principles of many existing science policy interface panels. I'd be happy to hear other views on this interesting question.
Thank you, Niko. Karen, have you got a view on this one in particular?
Niko has addressed it. I'm not sure if any of the other panelists might have an opinion. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, any other panelists have a response to this question regarding the role of industry in the process? Yes.
Yeah, maybe I would like to add a few points. I think in the industry also, it's a very kind of important because of the complexity of the plastics and chemical. information. So data is very key in this case. So I think industry has a very important role in that sense. So that's my feeling. So and so there should be some kind of interaction and inclusion of such inputs in that regard.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amela. I'd like to then go on another question we've had. This one is from Sith Roth. Can we classify plastic waste generally, single-use plastics, as hazardous waste, and why? So can we classify particularly single-use plastics as hazardous waste? Anyone want to try to tackle that one? I can't see hands or anything in this system, so I have kind of relying on people to sort of speak up. If you wish to answer, one of the panelists want to answer this. Can we classify single-use plastics as hazardous waste?
I might have a start.
Yeah.
I think the term hazardous is very specific. We've also used the term in the report of concern, which might be more appropriate to something like this because it is of concern if it's going to leak easily into the environment. But hazardous is a really technical thing to prove. So I think lumping all single-use plastics under that might be problematic. But I'll open up and see if anyone else has something to add to that. Thank you.
Maybe I could put Christos on the spot here, because if it's hazardous to human health, then it's hazardous, I suppose. Christos, do you have a view on this?
Sure. I think it's important to bring in the health angle here. When we talk about something being hazardous, we're normally talking about one of three things. We're talking about hazards to the environment, hazards to human health, or hazards that relate to your intrinsic risk of exposure. So those are things like bioaccumulation or long distance transport that we see in the definition of POPs. I would like to step back a little bit on this question and say that this is the importance of having a robust science policy interface. There's a need to define what what hazardous properties are going to be considered within this treaty. Those working from sort of the human health perspective are keen to see broad consideration of hazards of plastics that include endocrine disruption in particular, where there are more emerging recognition of this as a hazard category that we haven't been seeing in prior multilateral environmental agreements. The other point that I want to make is that we should be looking at this optimistically in understanding what the next generation of plastics or alternative materials can avoid the hazards that are in current plastics. So I do want to go back to this idea of having that solid scientific input in defining the terms around hazard and then evaluating plastics or their constituents against those hazards.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question here. I'd like to, if I could, direct this one to the opening remarks from Michelle and Walter, the member states, because I think also we have this question about to make sure that the future plastic treaty has a strong scientific body, which not only is policy relevant, but also avoids being policy prescriptive. So I wonder if Walter or Michelle, if you're there, have any views on this, the creation of this body that would be incorporated into the instrument. Putting people on the spot doesn't always work.
It's not working.
Yes, Walter.
Camera.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was trying to set up the camera again, but It doesn't seem to be working.
We can hear you anyway.
Let me try to change then to yours, if I can. Thank you, Peter. Just if you could very brief repeat the question, because I was in a different computer.
Okay. Oh, repeat the question. Yes, the question is, how do we make sure that the future plastic treaty has a strong scientific body, which is not only policy relevant, but also avoids being policy prescriptive?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, it's still to be determined. I think the two processes, since there will be sort of running in parallel, the one of the SPP and the INC process. At the end of the day, even though they have a different scope, different mandate, that still is being determined. They have, as we have seen, there was both mandates of resolutions that have very similar sort of principles, characteristics of what that role should be. That's what I was putting the stress on the complementarity. I think in both cases we have that sort of prescription or mandate of not being prescriptive and still be policy relevant. I think the key will be to ensure the specificity for each of the fulfillment of its functions. We have seen that most, at least in what we saw in the first two sessions or two parts of the first session of the SPP and what we saw in the INC 1 or 2, I think there is a clear majority of states and other stakeholders advocating for the need for that function to be fulfilled, but at the same time, the need for the openness and for this complementarity. So we so far see that the role of the SPP could be, as the report sort of divided in the more functions, not the ones of the 4 that have been put forward so far, but into more. That could be at least the report talks about 10, but it also divides on focus areas, and one of those could be the one on plastic pollution. While in the different submissions and the different discussions in the first 2 INC sessions, also there have been voices advocating for a very focused, specific role of relevant science-based information, including, for instance, in terms of future listing or not, future determination of hazards or not, especially when we talk about so many additives, components of plastics of concern and other parts of concern. So it's hard to say, but what will be the future of that relevance without being prescriptive. But once again, I think the specificity in the delivery of its functions that will be determined, in our view, that the fulfillment of that role in both cases in a very strict accordance to its mandate. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Walter. We are running out of time, but I will try to get one last question in. This one is from, I think it said Sinine. I'm sorry. So this person is asking in particular to Amila Abanayaka. The question is, why stop identifying and managing the conflict of interest and not aim to prevent and eliminate it? Can you address this one, Amila? Quickly too. We were running very close to the end.
So maybe I got the wrong way. So eliminating plastic. So is that the question?
Eliminating the conflict of interest.
Okay.
I think. Yeah. Why not just trying to manage it as opposed to actually eliminate it? Not have. Yeah.
My personal opinion, my understanding is everybody has some kind of interest based on their workplace or their works kind of thing. So maybe it's better to prepare some kind of guideline and try to identify and then take action. So that way is better. So elimination, maybe it's a real challenge. My personal feeling is even if I go and do lab experiment or something, so maybe I have some kind of can be based on the funding source, so my some kind of experience institute, like, so there can be so many factors. So that's my kind of feeling. So try to have guidelines and try to identify. So we need to express and then try to identify, and sometime maybe we can avoid in certain cases. For example, like if I maybe have certain conflicts in some aspect, so then I need to avoid engaging such kind of activity. But in some cases, maybe I don't have such kind of conflicts, then I can engage. So in that case, it's important to identify which kind of conflicts and interests are there. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I guess in a nutshell, we could say the goal would be to prevent and eliminate conflicts of interest, but we have to have tools, and identifying it first is, of course, the priority. So thank you very much. I want to thank all of the speakers today. Thank you very much for the listeners for asking very interesting questions. And I guess I wish everyone involved in INC3 next week a very productive meeting in Nairobi. Safe travel to all of you traveling to Nairobi next week. And thanks once again to all the speakers. Have a pleasant afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.